I will start right at the very beginning of the book. Literally on page 1. Sunshine and springtime are notoriously rare bedfellows in Vancouver, British Columbia. One day when I was 4 or 5 years old, my mother took me into the forest a few blocks from home. She'd heard that the frog pond, as it was known, was brimming with tadpoles. Cinching the deal that fateful day were scattered, caressing rays of sun. The event, one of my earliest memories, began with a brief, loamy walk down a forest trail. The trees were thick with moisture, still dripping from the relentless drizzling rains. Arriving at the pond, I scampered to the water's edge and squatted down, staring intently. It was a few moments before I realized that each of the frenetic black blobs before me was a distinct life form. Wearing tall black rubber boots, I stepped tentatively into the water, captivated by the larval swarm. I bent over and scooped up several with my hands to get a closer look. Bulging eyes, blob-like bodies, and long, slimy, transparent tails worked madly against my fingers. Captivated, I inched out further and further still, gasping as the water suddenly overtopped a boot. Many years later, my mother told me that she'd started to object, but thought better of it. After hesitating briefly, imagining the tadpoles now darting around my sock, I took another willful step into the muck. The second boot flooded. I was really in it now, sharing this pond universe with jillions of frogs to be. Stepping gingerly so as to avoid any inadvertent amphibicide, I eventually found myself at the pond's center, the water now above waist level. The sense of wonder and the smile across my face grew in tandem as I picked up handful after handful of squirming tadpoles. Immersed in that miniature sea of pollywogs, I felt, perhaps for the first time in my life, a deep and ecstatic sense of oneness with nature. So, I'm willing to bet, and I've done this now with a whole bunch of audiences, so I know that this is the case. I'm willing to bet that if we did an exercise and I invited you to close your eyes and imagine a place that was really meaningful to you as a kid. Look at you, what a nice guy. That you would imagine a place that was outside. The vast majority of us do. And what concerns me is that the kind of experience I described right there doesn't happen for kids anymore. Kids don't spend that time outside. And the statistics are absolutely staggering, at least from my perspective. The average American child currently spends about 4 to 7 minutes a day playing outdoors, which is on the order of 90% less than their parents did. That same average American kid spends 7 to 10 hours a day looking at screens. That same kid can identify on the order of 1,000 corporate logos and less than a dozen plants native to where they live. Now, on the one hand, you might go, okay, who cares? Like, we're living in a technological world. We've all got these cell phones. What difference does it make? Well, apparently a lot. And this is why I wrote this book. Obesity, attention deficit disorder, diabetes, depression, all of these conditions in more are skyrocketing in kids to the point where a U.S. Surgeon General recently announced that this generation of kids growing up could be the first to have a life expectancy shorter than that of their parents. That's pretty staggering. So, on the one hand, we have a crisis in childhood. On the other hand, I argue, and I haven't had anyone present a convincing case to the contrary, that we also have this crisis of sustainability which can't be solved until we bridge the children-nature gap. So here's my logic. Ask 100 scientists, what are the most pressing issues of the time right now? And you will hear climate change, species extinctions. You know, we could lose on the order of half the species around now by the end of this century. Habitat destruction, whole range of things, all very depressing topics. I don't see how we can address those topics successfully unless we care about where we live. And why would we possibly care if we don't spend any time outside? At its heart, sustainability is a local phenomenon. So if we don't get kids connected to nature, I don't see that we're going to be able to move towards sustainability. So I argue that bridging this gap is one of the greatest and most overlooked crises of our time. And that may sound like hyperbole, but I truly believe it. And so before I wrote this book, I looked around and I thought, well, every city in this country has dozens of organizations that are working to connect kids with nature. Think about it. Natural history museums, botanic gardens, zoos, environmental educators, wilderness outfitters, you name it, boys and girls clubs, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. And yet, we are arguably more separated from nature at this moment than we've ever been. So whatever we're doing at some level isn't working, and we need to do something else. And so, if we have this crisis in nature connection, the obvious question is, how do people connect with nature? And so I thought with all these organizations out there working on it, there had to be a plethora of books describing how the process worked. I couldn't find one. So I said, well, I'm going to sit down and research this and write about it, and that's what I've done with How to Raise a Wild Child. And it's been a really interesting journey. I've learned a tremendous amount. Many of you know my daughter Jade, and Jade has been the proving ground, the test case for a lot of the things that I write about in the book, and she features pretty prominently in the book. And she has, I've learned as much from her as she has from me, put it that way. So if you look at why this transition has happened within a generation, that we could go from free-range childhoods, where most of us just were basically kicked out when we got home from school or on weekends, and if the door wasn't locked, it was certainly not expected that you would come back until it was dark or whatever. That was the standard. And we've gone from that to, a few weeks ago, a couple in Maryland had their children taken away briefly for letting their 6 and 8-year-old walk a mile home. So somebody complained, the police came, picked up the kids, brought them home, said to the parents, you've abandoned your children, we're thinking about taking your children away and giving them to child services. And this is now happening in places around the country because parents are letting kids walk a mile, something that most of us did freely as kids. So what the hell happened, right? This is all in a generation. There's the fear factor. We all, not all, the vast majority of us are paranoid about our kids being taken, even though the odds of your child being abducted by a stranger are no greater at this moment than they were in 1950, 1960, or 1970. So it's media hype that's driving a lot of this. But having said that, the fear is real, and I've experienced some of it too with my own daughter, and certainly my wife Tony does. And so we can't just blow it off and say, go away. It's very real. There's the busy factor. The kids have more homework. We schedule them with lessons. They do, organized sports. They do all this stuff. So there's no time to go and play outside. And then there's the siren call of digital devices and the urge to stay connected all the time. And if you put all these things together, it makes it very, very difficult sometimes to even convince kids to go outside, particularly if they haven't done it before. If a kid reaches about 8 or 9 or 10 and hasn't spent much time outdoors, which happens now, believe it or not, there are many children that reach that age without an unsupervised moment in their lives. And compare that to a generation ago. If you take those kids and you say, go outside and play, they're going to say, what are you talking about? I want to stay in here on the screen. I got nothing. It's boring out there. Well, think about being a kid. We certainly didn't think that kick the can was boring, or roam in the neighborhood with friends, or whatever trouble we got into. And most of us survived, in fact, all of us here obviously survived to tell the tale. So there's got to be a culture shift. It happened in one generation, and what frightens me the most is, to use Richard Lou's metaphor, are we the last children in the woods, right? If our generation grows old and the next generation doesn't have kids that are going outside, well then they're going to grow up and they're not going to value nature and they're not going to send their kids outside. So we're at this critical moment right now. We have to shift things around. And what's interesting, what's fascinating to me is that as I go around and talk about this and read the studies, and there have been pretty big studies on this, no parent says, my kid doesn't need nature. Around the world, the study's been done, there was a study in about 8 countries, and people came back and unanimously, it was like 88% said, yes, not only do my kids need nature, that they aren't getting enough of it, and I need to get them out more. So the awareness at some level is there, but we're not prioritizing it. And my argument would be, we need to think about time in nature the same way we think about literacy. That we read to our kids at night, and we will make time for that because we want our kids to learn to read. But we consider nature to be a leisure option. If they get time, maybe we'll go out to the park on the weekend. But all the studies suggest that nature should not be an option. That kids in early childhood absolutely need unstructured, free play, what the psychologists refer to as play, which means no parental intervention. The kids are driving the play, and this is critical not just for physical aspects like agility and coordination and balance, which improve if kids are playing in natural structures outside, but it also turns out to be critical for growing brains, that it helps them learn critical thinking and problem solving, that in unstructured play, kids use their imaginations more. They are more creative. And they need that as their brains grow. I mean, this is at the point, the neurons in the brain, they either proliferate, they get cut back, or they get cut back, and the ones that stay behind are coated with this myelin to make things flow smoother. In other words, you either use it or lose it in your brain. And if you don't use all your senses to detect the outdoors, if you don't lose that ability to be creative, you're going to not have that later. And you look at syndromes like attention deficit disorder. There's a pretty great argument out there right now with about 17% of kids on Ritalin or some drug for attention deficit disorder, which is just a staggering statistic on its own. There's a lot of evidence that phenomenon has been driven by the indoor migration, that kids don't get a chance to reset. And think about it. I mean, we are primates after all. And think about taking this young primate and sticking it in a room, classroom, room at home or whatever, and saying, just stay here all day long and read this book and do this stuff and stay focused. Like, we'll give you 5 minutes for lunch and that's about it, How can we possibly expect that kid to stay focused? We know that this doesn't work. If you look at other education systems in other countries, like Finland, which rates top of the world, they go the opposite direction. They have longer lunch hours. They have long recess. They often add 15 minutes between classes. They assign less homework. And they are at the top of the education system. So there's better ways of doing things than what we're doing. And this does relate to education as much to parenting, and I wrote this book as much for educators as for parents. So we've hit this point, this crisis point. So the question is, if people recognize that it's an important thing, no, the people aren't disagreeing, then how do we remove the obstacles and get people outside? And so I offer a whole bunch of tips in the book. It's tips at the end of every chapter. But I want to just throw out 3. And I use the acronym NEW to describe them. And the first thing is just, the N is just to notice nature. It's staggering how we don't notice nature. And I have to admit myself, in writing this book and learning about nature connection, I realized that my own connection to nature, even though I've spent years of my life living in tents and being outdoors and all those things, my own nature connection was pretty pitiful. I wasn't paying attention really to the things around me, and I wasn't really aware of what was going on. So the first thing is just to notice nature. So when you step outside in the morning, stop for like 10 seconds. We can all afford that. And just notice what's going on. What the clouds look like, can you hear birds, there are flowers blooming, whatever it is, just stop. Because if you notice nature, your kids will notice it too. Kids, of course, do more what we do than what we say. They watch us. And so if we value the natural world, they will too. And so just starting by noticing it is key. Or if you're driving with kids somewhere, just say, hey, you know, why do you think that there's no leaves on that tree? Or do you hear any birds? Like, I thought we had birds here like 2 weeks ago. And just get kids thinking about it. So the first thing is just to notice, start noticing. And I talk in here about a wonderful fellow who I met here in California named John Young, who teaches this technique called bird language. And if you haven't heard about it, it's a really powerful thing. I first saw him at Point Reyes do a workshop, and I have to say, being the scientist, I was pretty skeptical, because it all seemed a little mumbo jumbo to me. And he was sitting there and he was talking, and he said, did you notice? What do you hear behind me? And everyone went, nothing. And he goes, well, what did you hear a few minutes ago? And everyone said, yeah, there was birds singing. And he said, well, what happened? What's going on? And everyone, I just thought, well, birds stopped singing, so what, And he goes, birds just don't stop like that. Birds don't do things randomly. Singing for them is life and death. If birds are a bunch of birds there and they stop singing, they don't just all fly away, they stop because there's a predator. And if they've all stopped up in the trees, it usually means an aerial predator, another bird, probably a Cooper's hawk, because that's the bird that can fly right into the trees and pick them up. And the scientist in me is saying, oh, come on, bullshit. What are the odds that the bird stops singing and he can tell that there's a Cooper's hawk around? So he starts talking again, and literally 30 seconds later, a Cooper's hawk flies out of the forest and goes over. And immediately the bird starts singing again. And I thought, wow, this guy actually has some mojo. Like, I want to understand more about this. And so he advocates this thing that I write about in the book called Sit Spot, where you just go and sit in one place every day for like 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and you just listen and you become aware of what's going on. And it turns out the birds really only say 4 different things. Every species has different calls for it. But you can tell the mood of a place just by what the birds are doing. And you can tell if there's a predator coming, whether it's an aerial predator, a predator on the ground, whatever. You can walk through a forest, and if you're in tune with the birds, if there's somebody coming the other way down the trail, you can often tell that they're coming when they're up to a quarter mile away just by what the birds do, if you're paying attention. And this was something that all humans knew for most of the 200,000-year tenure of humans, because their lives depended on it. John Young travels to the Kalahari every year and spends time with the San Bushmen and learns what they do. And it turns out that kids know bird language. They all know it because they have to. That's how they find food, and that's how they avoid becoming food. That's where you know where the lions are. In the Kalahari, there are cobras that can go faster than you can run and will chase you down. So you don't want to encounter one of those. You want the birds to tell you where they are. So if you do this thing where you just sit outside and get used to the place, you'll find that when you first started, you were missing most of it. And after you keep doing it for a while, you start to realize there's that chickadee that's missing over there today. I wonder what's going on there. And you'll start to get a sense of all the characters that live there, because the birds aren't just coming and going. They make nests, and they spend time. So if you do that with kids, especially kids once they reach about 7 or 8, then they'll start to value it and do that too. And it's just an amazing way to relax. Cortisol, stress hormone goes down, heart rate goes down. It's just a healthy thing to do. And it's just a few minutes a day sitting outside. Right? So we had notice, and that's the big part of noticing. The second part is to engage. That's the E in new. And by engage, I mean, full-on, multi-sensory, hands-on, walking into the pond with the tadpoles, kind of engaging, the kind of stuff that typically doesn't happen today. I was an adult before I realized that the hero of that story, of me walking into the pond, which to this day I still remember vividly, the hero of the story was my mother, because she didn't tell me to stop. She just smiled as I walked into this pond with water above my waist. I mean, how many parents would do that today? We're always telling kids no. We say, no, don't throw that rock, don't pick up that stick, don't climb that tree, stay out of that mud. You know, connecting with nature is a contact sport. And both kids and nature can take it. This whole notion of staying on the trail, I'm sorry, but it's not going to work. And I think it fails at a number of levels. If you're trying to preserve a natural area, the worst thing you can do is tell people in all places to stay on the trail, because nature connection happens through that bodily interaction. And if kids aren't interacting with it, they're not going to form any kind of emotional bond. And saving places like the Marin Headlands, there's no guarantee that Marin Headlands will stay saved and stay public space. We sort of think about it that way, and I thank goodness for all the people that took the time to save it. But the next generation could go, no, we don't need this anymore. And if they're not getting out and enjoying it, why would they value it? They've got to experience it hands-on. So the engagement part, the E, is critical. Let kids get in there and get dirty. You know, clothes can be washed, cuts heal. Kids need to take risks. If they don't, then they're going to just take risks as adolescents and not know how to deal with those risks. So let them take them as kids. And I know, Michael, you advocated this when you were teaching school. You told me your stories. So that's the E. The W is wonder. And by wonder, I mean just this sense of curiosity about the world. And it's an emotional thing as much as an intellectual thing. And there's a lot of parents who don't want to take their kids out in nature, believe it or not, because they feel paranoid because they don't know anything about nature in their minds. They go, if I can't be the expert to my kid, I don't feel comfortable going out and trying to make them aware of nature, because they're going to ask me stuff and I don't know the answer. But the secret is, you don't need to know the answer. You don't want to present the answer, because questions turn out to be way more powerful at sparking curiosity and wonder than answers are. And I'll read one more section from here that took place in Muir Beach with Jade, just to illustrate this. One day, while Jade and I were out walking near our home in California, she spotted a tall bird sitting perfectly motionless in a clearing adjacent to the creek. "What kind of bird is it?" she queried. My strong inclination was to blurt out the answer, particularly since it was one of my favorites, a great blue heron. Instead, I turned to her. "What kind of bird do you think it is?" She thought for a moment and came back with, "Maybe a heron. I'm not sure." "Great idea," was my response. "Let's sit here and watch it for a while." And so we did. "Why do you think they have those long beaks?" I asked. "For catching critters," was Jade's quick reply. "So what do you think it's doing now?" "Maybe hunting," came her response. "Well, what do you think it's hunting for?" "I don't know. Probably rodents." Sure enough, within a couple of minutes, the heron performed its classic slow-motion head bow, as if in solemn prayer, followed by a lightning strike jab at the ground. When it rose up again, it held some kind of small mammal firmly in its beak. "I was right. It's got a rodent." We watched as the giant bird skillfully maneuvered its prey within its jaws and then swallowed it whole, the neck contorting as the animal passed down the gullet. Fascinated, we stayed long enough to watch 2 repeat performances as the heron depleted the clearing of its rodent population. When we got home, Jade immediately grabbed one of the bird books and paged through it until she found the correct entry. "Look, Daddy, that bird was a heron, a great blue heron." When a child asks a question and you know the answer, it's natural to want to share it, providing the answer makes us feel good, and we presume that kids really want to know. But this inclination can lead us astray. Oftentimes, our response ends the interaction by cutting off curiosity. Counterintuitively, children are often looking for our engagement more than our answers, hoping that the focus of their attention will become ours too. By turning the question back on them, we crack open a learning opportunity, a chance for them to actively participate in solving a mystery. If I had followed my first inclination and named the heron when asked, chances are good that we would have kept walking and that Jade would not have remembered the name later. A missed opportunity. Instead, to this day, Jade fondly talks about the hunting heron. Rest assured, I've blown the same kind of opportunity many times by giving the answer instead of asking a question. So that's the W, the wonder part. How do we help keep the wonder there? Every single kid is full of wonder. Put a baby on the ground and they're all over the place. And I write in the book about, we often talk about babies having the attention span of a gnat. Turns out this is really incorrect. Babies and young kids just have a different kind of attention. Instead of a spotlight form of attention, they have this lantern form of attention. So they're just paying attention to more stuff than we are. And they're really good at it. They're better at it than we are. So it's good for them to go and do all these things. Now, by the time most kids reach 9 or 10 years old, that sense of wonder, magic, is gone. And it's sad when this happens, but too often kids don't like science anymore. That's the classic age when girls in particular, but boys too, lose interest in science. They don't even equate nature with science. And it's because we've beaten that sense of wonder out of them in the classroom, at home, wherever. And so if we can find activities, asking questions, watching them to see what they're interested in, and asking questions about those things, building on that sense of wonder, becoming a co-adventurer with them, you can keep that sense of wonder alive and help them become lifelong learners and really loving nature with that sense of engagement and always looking around and doing the same thing, asking questions. So it's really those three elements, that sort of notice, engage, and wonder. Anyone can do them any day. It takes just mere minutes to do it. And my thought is, if we're going to shift the culture back so that kids are engaging with nature, it has to be simple. It has to involve new habits. On the website for the book, raiseawildchild.com, we created this challenge for parents, what I call the 30 by 3 nature challenge. Just pledge to getting kids outside for 30 minutes 3 times a week. That's it. And just don't even believe me that it makes a difference. Just try it and see what happens. Kids will be happier. They'll treat you better. They'll sleep better. It's a great thing. We know it's great for kids. It's been demonstrated again and again. And kids need that kind of unstructured time. And if they don't know what to do, then maybe you can help them. Maybe show them kick the can or whatever it was that got you going as a kid outside. And I'll throw in one last thing as a tip, and that is story, sort of the power of narrative. And it goes both ways. That is, when kids come back inside from being out, ask them about their experience. Pull stories out of them. Well, what did you do? What did you see? Well, what did it look like? What did you do after that? And what did it do? And by doing that, you can take what was for them potentially a mundane experience they would forget the next day, and you can help them craft a meaningful story that they may remember for the rest of their lives. And on the flip side, you tell them stories. Think about when you were a kid and what it felt like to hide behind the bush when you were playing kick the can and you were going to make that rush to actually go and kick the thing and you're hoping you don't get seen and you go and do it. I mean, tell those stories of catching animals, whatever it was you did out in nature, seeing stars, snowball fights, I don't care. Telling those stories are the kinds of things that make kids go, wow, I want to do that too. And those types of things are also powerful at building a sense of wonder. So I want to wrap it up there, but I'll add in one more element. And I started this off by saying that we have all these organizations that are working towards nature connection and we're still not doing it. So the question is, why? Why are we failing? And the reality is these organizations, and I work at a natural history museum that's doing this too, these organizations are doing great work. The vast majority of them are doing terrific work, and they're impacting the lives of dozens, hundreds, in some cases thousands of kids. But we are not moving the needle even a little bit at the civic level. We're just not making a dent. In particular, the Children in Nature movement, although it's growing quickly, is largely a white, affluent movement. And if we're going to be successful, it has to be a movement for all kids, no matter what their family income, no matter what their skin color. And in order to do that, we have to not just give kids access to nature, which is one half of the equation, not just engage kids with nature, but make sure that there's enough nature around for them to really engage with. And of course, what often happens is that in underserved neighborhoods, there isn't much in the way of nature. There's no parks, there's no green spaces, many of them don't have backyards. So how do we do this? Well, it turns out it's actually dead simple. It's as simple as planting native plants. There's a wonderful book called Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy. And he's done the research to show that if you plant native plants will attract more native insects. The native insects evolve to consume those native plants. Makes sense. And those native insects will attract native birds and other animals. So if you want to rewild a place, plant native plants. It's that simple. And imagine if we could do this in backyards, in courtyards, in schoolyards. Imagine if every schoolyard had native plants in it. And it could become a living ecosystem, part of the local ecosystem. And if all the schoolyards did it, you'd create pathways for migratory birds and butterflies. And over time, you would transform that city. Now, I don't think we can get to that point with all these individual organizations, even if we double or triple the number of them. I think we need to collaborate. And Antonio has heard me talk about this till probably wants me to shut up, but I'm going to say it one more time for you anyway, Antonio. I think there's really strong potential in every major city in this country to create these collaborations of organizations that can leverage each other's assets and do things so that every organization becomes a different tool on a Swiss Army knife. And they're working together. They can go into a community, including underserved communities, and say, what do you need? What are the things that are most important to you? And oftentimes, where I am in Denver, we've been doing this, and what we hear a lot is food and education. Well, guess what? Rewilding can help with both of those things. And so we're talking with a number of underserved communities right now in Denver about building this consortium that can help rewild these communities, one community at a time, and over time we can do whole cities. And if we can do that and raise awareness and get kids out, within a generation, we could live in communities that are healthy for both people and nature. I go so far as to say you cannot have a healthy population of people unless the environment's healthy too. And you cannot have a healthy environment unless you have a healthy population. The two go hand in hand. We often think about health as if it's somehow distinct from the environment, but it's not. And so I think we are at this moment in time when we could start to transform the meaning of a city. That traditionally cities have been places where the wild things aren't, right? And if we could help to rewild cities, then we literally transform the meaning of what they are and create healthier kids along the way. So I probably spoke a little too long, but thanks for listening, and I would love to just open up a conversation and hear from you all about your own personal experiences here. So please throw some stuff at me or at everybody else.
I'll start. So recently, Anya Kamenez was here talking about her book called The Test, about standardized testing in schools and how we overtest and things like that. And she commented that she saw a company locally to here that's creating a game version of learning. So kids will go on, play this game, and they have to they have to answer some questions to move on in this game instead of learning things. And this is all part of this Common Core that's being implemented. It's all being funded by the same people. And yesterday I saw Jim Steyer, he's the CEO of Common Sense Media, speak. And he was all excited about it and actually introduced us to this game. I didn't actually see it play. It's called Welcome to Anywhere. And it occurred to me, realizing that if this game does happen, the further disconnect in the schools, within the four walls, to teachers teaching, to how parents can control their kids' education. If everything's moving online, you mentioned if you don't exercise certain parts of your brain, you lose it. That whole process of connecting and empathy and with the teacher is a concern.
Yeah, it's almost like a Big Brother name. What is it called?
It's called Welcome to Anywhere.
Welcome to Anywhere. It's like, might as well just say Welcome to Nowhere, right?
It kind of feels that way.
It's
kind of
the same thing.
And going over the Golden Gate Bridge, they're tearing down, the toll booths. Where there used to be people there, now
Right.
it's electronic, and you're going, you start feeling like maybe, are we heading there?
Well, one of the things I argue in here is the opposite of that we need to have more place-based education that's focused on local place. I consider it a tragedy that a kid can go to school in Marin County and another kid going to school in Miami or Tulsa or Buffalo can be learning exactly the same thing. So that when the kid leaves the school, whatever they've learned has no relevance whatsoever to where they live. There's this new model. It's not even that new. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it's now being implemented at much higher levels. And it's got different names, environmental education, expeditionary learning, all these things, but it's all place-based learning. And it turns out that if you get kids outside learning about their local place, not just nature, but culture too, that no surprise, the kids are more engaged, they do better on tests, they're physically healthier, they drop out less, all these different things. And yet that model is still on the periphery right now, and we need to think about other ways to get it more engaged. So thank you for sharing that. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm the superintendent of schools here in Larkspur Corte-Madera School District.
Hi, Valerie.
And I just want to tell you there is hope. We just built a new school, opened it in the fall. Not a lot of people anymore in the state get that opportunity, but this school was built not in square boxes, and let me tell you, it was like, there was a period of time where we thought, are we ever going to just be able to break away from the 960 square foot box that we call classrooms? And what we tried to do with our new school, which is over in the other side of the freeway, it's called the Cove, was this idea of indoor-outdoor, lots of transparency, lots of natural light, rooms that aren't square boxes but jut out a little bit, creating different ceiling levels for kids. But we also are really trying to make it a place-based place. So we're trying, and it is probably everyone in this room knows how hard it is to move education, but there are folks that have that vision, and we're trying to do that. So thank you. I'm sitting here thinking you would be phenomenally welcomed in this, speaking to a group of 200 of our parents in this district.
Thank you, Valerie. Appreciate that. Thanks for speaking up. Yes, over here.
Just wondering, what would happen if your favorite subject is science anyways, and you just go out into nature every single day no matter what?
She doesn't do that.
Yeah, that's probably you would grow up to be a healthy, well-adjusted person. So, paleontology is one of the first words I learned how to spell. I was a geek from a very young age.
Well, it's not like I was the first
So
person.
I'll leave it to other people to judge whether or not I'm well-adjusted, but I think that's terrific. And there are kids that, despite the system that they're thrown into, even if it's negative, they still thrive, and there always will be kids like that. And it is the rest of the kids that we need to worry about, not folks like you who are probably going to love science no matter
I have
what.
a rule about technology where I have to go outside for the same amount, at least the same amount of time I play video games.
Actually, she has to read the
And
same
go
amount of
outside.
time.
And go outside. And play
go-
music.
Mhm.
etc.
But we go outside
Hey,
anyway.
thanks for coming. Yeah, no, that's great. I just want to be clear that what I am not arguing is that we need to go back to nature and give up technology. That's the last of it. My argument is that we need to move forward into a world where we embrace both nature and technology and bring nature more back into balance. And we can use technology to help in this nature connection. There's all kinds of geocaching, apps you can download to help identify things. There's a dozen different ways of doing it. So I just want to be clear on that. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I have a friend who teaches the garden, or she's the person in charge of the garden at an elementary school in Sonoma County, and she remarks at how thankful the kids are to get away from the books and to get their hands dirty in the garden and to learn about snails and to learn about composting. And I think in a certain sense, one positive countervailing trend is the food movement and the gardening movement in schools, and that can be, it seems to be a mainstream way for schools to say, oh, well, we're going to let the kids be in the garden. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a nature, it's just she finds that she's amazed at how the kids love the contrast. I also think when I was a kid, the school that I went to during recess, there was a little bit of nature. It wasn't all blacktop. There was a creek or a small little hill, and we would spend time on that. I think recess is undervalued, and if the kids were, in my day, you were allowed to do that. You were allowed to spend a little bit of time damming up the little water that was coming, just rained, and I think if kids were allowed to respect recess, because I know that I have a daughter who went to school, they kind of disrespect recess now, or it's kind of short and irrelevant and not given the respect it was due. I mean, we really, as kids, thought, wow, recess is much better than school. I mean, it was time to be outside, you know what I mean?
Right.
And I think, and same thing with lunch. Lunch was time to be outside, and her school disrespects recess. Her school here in Marin disrespects lunch to the point where they just keep constricting and constricting and constricting. It's like, that's not really important, but so.
And thanks for bringing up the garden thing. We have broken the most simple equation of all that we experience every day. Food equals nature. For most of us, there is no relationship between the food we eat and the natural world, even though everything we eat was once living and comes from nature. And so helping to rebuild that, one of the greatest ways is through gardening. And if you want kids to eat vegetables, the best way to do that is to have them grow those vegetables, because they're way more likely to eat them. So that is a movement that is sweeping. It's super prevalent in California.
Yeah.
No surprise, but it's also sweeping this country and many others. So that's a great trend. Tycho?
Yeah, I live at Muir Beach, as you know, and when we were living there, our son would literally leave the house with his friends. They all used to love to come over from Mill Valley, go to the beach, and then I'd have to pack a lunch and try to find where they were. And it was wonderful. Now, if you try to do that, it's impossible because we're preserving the sand dunes. They can't go into the creek and look for the tap at all. They can't go scurrying through the brush to look for the cat of different animals. I mean, that's all gone. And there's this movement that we're kind of facing at the beach with the National Park Service. I don't know if you've been kept abreast of that, where there was an article on NPR today where the National Park System, which used to be the gift, it was the heritage we were going to give to generations and generations, is now being turned into kind of like a Disney experience where there are clean paths and you don't dare go off those paths. And it's all fee-based. To get into these parks now, you're going to have to pay, which is going to exclude the very group that you want to engage more, to not make it such a white experience. And so some of us at the beach are trying to make a position statement, if nothing else, because we can't stop what the TLC has done and what the GGNRA has done, but to just make the locals a little bit more aware of the fact that this pristine environment that we used to love to live in is being restricted from us.
Yeah.
And that's a national movement that should be happening that isn't happening.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that they're shooting themselves in the foot for the reasons I said before. Why are people going to take care of those places if they don't get a chance to go and engage with them? Yeah. Other questions?
One of the examples from your beach again is the barbecue that we run there, where kids who usually carrying a smartphone in their hip pocket are wandering around tuned in all the time. But when they come to the barbecue, there's no access to anything. And all of a sudden they find themselves in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of adults and loud music banging around and creeks flowing through and things like that happening, and they start to have fun. So the hardest thing of all, in the creek,
Yeah,
in the
they-
trees, chasing each other around, doing whatever they need to do, but all of a sudden the kid comes back out of them again. So the hardest thing, the hardest challenge, I think, one of the harder challenges is how do you draw them back, or how do you turn it off?
That barbecue is really fascinating for a lot of reasons, and it is one of the only examples I know of anywhere around here. It's the one time of the year where parents just let their kids go. And nobody criticizes any of the parents for it. Nobody has any clue where their kids are. The kids are just out running around. And that's a pretty powerful thing. And even if it's in a restricted area, there's still lots of stuff going on. They could, whatever, bad stuff could happen, but folks are going,
Nobody's
no,
gotten
this
killed
is,
yet.
yeah, exactly. So, no, thank you. Other things?
There's another thing that I'm interested in, that our kids involved in, and is how you take community, how you take an urban center, and turn it into a outdoor magnet, so to speak, something that draws people to the outdoors, that entices them, that engages them in the outdoors. And I mean, there's the High Line in New York City where they took an old freeway and planted a park there, and all of a sudden it's an outside people place that people actually go out and enjoy nature. And they're actually, our son Eli is working on a project in Los Angeles with the LA River, which has the same potential. I mean, it's a big project, and it'll be amazing if it comes off. But if it does, it'll affect a lot. All those people who step outside of their buildings right now and just climb in their cars and drive down the freeways may step outside and just wander along the LA River. Bicycle, kayak, whatever. Look at the flowers, plant something. Who knows?
Well, you just answered your own question. That's how you do it. You take these projects, you have real plans, it's bottom up and top down, you have lots of partners involved. This is the kind of work that Antonio does all the time with his projects. And it's the kind of work that we need to do desperately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you do?
We'll come back to that.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I live in Mule Beach too, and I'm an
Thank you,
interior
Victoria.
designer.
I can tell from your accent.
And I'm an interior designer, and I look to nature constantly for colour palette and direction in design. And it never ceases to amaze me. Most of my clients are obviously adults, and they look at my work after a long project, and invariably they say to me, "Wow, you've just totally got it right, and we can't quite understand why. How did you know how to create this peaceful environment for us?" And I said, "It's all outside. It's just right there in front of your nose." So I think it's really important too to bring the outside into our immediate living circumstances and environments, whether they're schools, whether they're offices, whether they're homes, and to really recognise that which surrounds us and to create with that. Because when I walk on the beach and then I do a house in Sausalito and people say, "Oh, I feel so good in here," and I look at them and I say, "Do you know why? It's because I match the paint colour to the ocean or to the bay, and it's subliminal almost." But people get happy in environments that emulate nature.
Yeah, and Victoria, you and I have talked about this, but there's this whole notion that's growing of biophilic design where it isn't just wild nature or living things that we want to stick into our urban settings. It's images of nature. It's the colors of nature. It's just surrounding ourselves with these natural elements that make us feel good. So I totally agree. Yes, that's a great point.
I did want to say a few things. There was another positive development in Los Angeles. They're going to create a national monument of the San Gabriel Mountains, and hopefully that will engage a lot more people to visit their national monument as opposed to the way it is now, and that's coming. But the other thing, I have a daughter, and I'm familiar with her generation and the addiction to cell phones and screens. I think it's a powerful addiction, and I think it really draws people in, maybe even as bad as alcohol or drugs. And when we think in terms of nature, sometimes nature's call is a little bit more subtle and has a hard time competing with the instantaneous gratification that comes from, and the gain, for example, that comes to the screen. And I almost think sometimes that if you're in the business that you're in, or you're in the cause that you're in, you might want to assemble the best ways, I hesitate to say this, the most engaging and addictive things that you can bring to bear on the problem. And from my point of view, I actually think, for example, the ocean or the beach is pretty darn engaging. It's very difficult for human beings not to, in some sense, go, oh, wow, at the ocean and the beach. And so I used to play a lot of pickup basketball with the kids in Marin City. And they had never been out. Many of them had never been out to any of the parks in Marin, and let alone the ocean. And so, I mean, there's in some cases it's also a matter of getting transportation for kids who are not able to get out there, and their parents aren't familiar with these opportunities. So, I mean, I think getting more and more kids out to the pristine ocean is a good bet.
I think that's great. My daughter Jade went to school in Marin City for a while, to a charter school, and I organized this thing where I was taking kids from the school out to the ocean. And they could walk there, it's that close, right? But they had never been there. And we walked out, we went tide pooling, and they were looking at sea stars and anemones and that, and they couldn't believe they were alive. They thought they were fake. And the teacher, we were going away, and I felt so good because the kids were jazzed, and I was feeling so good about having taken them there, and they were pumped up and running along the beach. And we're leaving at the end of the day, walking off the beach, and the teacher says to me, this may be the last time they ever go to the beach. I just wanted to cry. That's just staggering, because there's not the value that's placed on it, and so there has to be culture change there too. So I wish we could take the ocean everywhere.
Yes, exactly. That's one of our best bets in terms of turning people onto nature.
All right. Well, shall we do one more? Is there one more question?
I'll do one more. I also interviewed on my site Jennifer Senior. She wrote All Joy and No Fun, The Paradox of Modern Parenting. And one of the questions that I asked her, because she was on Steve Colbert, and he always ends up sort of jabbing people a little bit towards the end, and he doesn't let them get a word in. So he said, something about, are you going to pay for your kids' psychiatric treatment with the proceeds of this book, something like that, because it was all about how kids are all joy, but they're no fun. And anyway, so I asked her if she wanted to answer that, and she said the problem's not with the kids, the problems are with the parents and modern day parenting, and a lot having to do with things that we never actually ever had to deal with. Like I can't call my mom and say, what did you do when I got my first Facebook account? Everything is so new, almost like we're reinventing it, and they're becoming the greatest experiment on this technology, is both us as parents and them as, because kids are sitting there looking at you while you're doing your thing too, right?
Yeah, most of us
I
check
do that.
our-
like I actually don't own a cell phone for that very reason. I haven't owned one since 2003.
Wow.
Yeah. And the average adult checks their email 42 times a day.
Wow.
So we haven't even trained ourselves.
No, and so that's
manage
definitely a
all of
challenge
that.
too. Well, listen, thank you all very, very much for coming. I appreciate it.